Right. Let's just dive right into this. Frankly, fascinating paradox. If you look at the history of global industry, the story is almost always the exact same. Efficiency replaces inefficiency, and machines replace hand craftsmanship. But today, we're exploring a specific, wild slice of automotive history where two legendary British brands did the exact opposite. I mean, why on earth did cars with ancient chassis designs and impossible-to-maintain engines become the absolute pinnacle of modern luxury? Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack the brilliant, calculated unreasonableness of British automotive engineering. Now, you might naturally assume that in the highly competitive automotive world, the most efficient, technologically advanced, and cost-effective design always wins out. Makes sense, right? But this analysis of British luxury manufacturing proves the exact opposite. As we'll see, survival for these brands didn't mean embracing the future of automation. Actually, it meant weaponizing their own past. To put this into perspective, just consider this staggering difference in labor. It took over 4,500 human hours. Yes, you heard that right, 4,500 hours to build a single Aston Martin during this era. Compare that to a mere 25 hours for a standard mass-produced car from a giant like Ford. So 4,500 hours versus 25. From a purely, capitalist perspective, that level of inefficiency is a total death sentence. But for the craftsmen at Newport Pagnell, it was actually a badge of honor. So that brings us to our first core theme, the threat of homogenization, or essentially global capitalism squaring off against traditional British craftsmanship. Back in the late 20th century, global giants like Ford, BMW, and Volkswagen were pushing incredibly hard for generic parts and robotic assembly. And honestly, this threatened to completely wipe out traditional craftsmanship. These mass production lines relied on robotic precision and parts sharing to slash build times down to an absolute fraction. But meanwhile, over at Aston Martin's Newport Pagnell and Bentley's Crewe factories, cars were still being painstakingly welded, tweaked, and hand-stitched by a literal army of artisans. The stark contrast here is just undeniable. Look at how even a high-end luxury sports car maker like Ferrari and Maranello was utilizing advanced automated lines mixed with their limited handcrafting. But the British brands? They were heavily, almost stubbornly, stacked with human labor. We're talking relying on hand-beaten aluminum and custom, on-the-spot welding reinforcements. It was a completely different world. So the crucial point we really need to understand is this specific battle. Cold, automated efficiency and modular platforms on one side, facing off against passionate inefficiency and deep, apprenticeship-level skills on the other. Think about it. If these British brands just adopted generic parts, they'd completely lose their soul. If they allowed generic computer diagnostics to replace the sensory intuition of a master mechanic, well, their workforce's highly specialized skills would just go extinct. So they absolutely needed a defense mechanism. And that leads us into the era of doping, a kind of parallel resistance movement happening right in the UK. Rather than just quietly surrendering to the mass market and fading into obscurity, these brands staged a simultaneous, frankly desperate resistance. I mean, they couldn't afford to build totally new, hyper-efficient platforms from scratch, so they heavily doped their existing ancient architectures. We can actually track this incredible parallel struggle starting back in 1967. Aston Martin breaks from their delicate Italian elegance, moving the DBS to a much heavier steel chassis just to rely on raw muscle. Meanwhile, Bentley, who had basically been forced to make rebadged Rolls-Royces, silently plotted a rebellion. By 1982, they shoved massive turbochargers into those Rolls-Royce clones to create the Mulsanne turbo, completely shattering that expected quiet elegance with raw forced induction power. And this whole crazy saga culminates in 1999, where both brands push their decaying, decades-old chassis designs to the absolute physical limits. Which brings us to the core concept here, the engineering wall, where inefficiency literally acts as a fortress. This brings us to the absolute climax of our story in the late 90s, where physical inefficiency was, and I mean this quite literally, weaponized into a deliberate engineering wall to protect these brands from being swallowed whole by corporate parent companies. Just consider the absolute madness of the 1999 Aston Martin V8 Vantage Le Mans. They frantically armed their ancient 1960s steel chassis with a massive 5.3-liter V8 strapped with twin superchargers. Guys, it was pushing 600 horsepower. A 1960s skeleton was never meant to handle that kind of twisting force. So what did they do? The craftsman had to manually weld intense steel gussets and reinforcements all over the frame just to stop the car from tearing itself apart. It wasn't elegant engineering by any stretch. It was pure brute force artisanal armor. And right alongside that, in a parallel act of pure defiance, Bentley staged their own rebellion with the Arnage Red Label. Their corporate overlords basically wanted them to use a perfectly rational, highly efficient modern BMW V8, but Bentley absolutely refused. Instead, they crammed their ancient, massive 6.75-liter pushrod V8 back into the car. They intentionally created an engine base so catastrophically tight, you literally couldn't even fit a finger between the engine block and the frame. It's wild. So why build this incredibly inconvenient design? Well, this wasn't just a symptom of bad, outdated engineering. No, it was an intentional, defensive moat. By creating an engineering environment this openly hostile, they ensured that generic computers and standardized manuals were utterly useless. You couldn't just plug in a diagnostic tool and figure it out. You needed the sensory intuition, the specific, bespoke tools, and honestly, the sheer obstinacy of British craftsmen. They basically built a wall out of pure inconvenience just to preserve their jobs and their brand's entirely distinct character. Now, the day-to-day realities of this wall were brutal, but absolutely necessary, because everything was crammed in so tightly, it could take hours, literally hours of painstaking labor, just to change a single spark plug. These giant engines generated intense thermal management issues, basically threatening to melt nearby wires. But it forced an absolute non-negotiable reliance on human mechanics. By totally rejecting modular BMW parts, they ensured that fixing a Bentley or an Aston Martin remained a highly specialized, almost stubborn craft that only they could do. All right, let's shift gears to luxury in the digital age and how we move from a physical moat to conceptual weight. So you've got to wonder, how did this desperate, sweaty struggle for physical survival in the 1990s evolve into what we now consider the ultimate symbol of modern luxury? I mean, how does an engineering nightmare suddenly become a massive selling point? Well, we can actually track this fascinating evolution in 3 distinct steps. It starts with that physical struggle and the doping of the 90s we just talked about. Step 2 is harmonization. Fast forward to 2010 and Bentley created the Mulsanne. It finally had a dedicated chassis specifically built for that old V8, meaning it wasn't a cramped nightmare anymore. But, and this is key, they kept the character of that old engine. This shifted the wall from being a physical necessity to a cultural symbol. And that brings us right up to step 3, conceptual exclusivity. We're holding on to massive, complex V12 engines today is a highly deliberate choice. Because today we live in a world totally governed by AI-optimized digital twin automotive design. We're talking perfectly simulated virtual models of cars before a single piece of metal is even bent, achieving aerodynamic perfection, maximum fuel efficiency, and a perfectly smooth ride. It's incredibly easy for any major automaker now. But here is the massive catch. Because perfection is so easy, perfection has become entirely generic. So doing things the hard, heavy, unreasonable way, that is what we call calculated unreasonableness. Just compare digital perfection with analog luxury for a second. Out there in the mass market, and even with a lot of high-end EVs, you get these perfectly calculated, optimal solutions, but they're entirely homogenized. On the flip side, modern flagships like the new Aston Martin Vanquish or the Ferrari 12 Cilindri deliberately offer an analog experience. They stubbornly refuse to give up their massive V12 engines. They actually want you to feel the physical mass transfer of the vehicle in the corners. They want that tactile feedback. They are using physical weight and complexity as their ultimate differentiator. So what was once an unreasonable, deeply inefficient manufacturing process, born out of a desperate, back-against-the-wall need to survive, has entirely transformed. It is now the ultimate mark of luxury. Think about it. In a market completely flooded with sterile, identical perfection, paying a massive premium for a machine that actually requires a human touch, a machine that boldly embraces its own dramatic flaws, that is the ultimate flex. I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. As AI, robotics, and global supply chains calculate the absolute perfect, most hyper-efficient solution for literally everything we consume, what human essence do we lose when we automate all the struggle away? Perhaps true luxury, right now and well into the future, lies exclusively in the things that stubbornly refuse to be optimized. Thanks so much for exploring this with me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.